Hello, my name is Sue Linderman. I am pleased to be with you for this series of 6 classes entitled Racism in America, the History We Didn't Learn in School. I graduated from Mount Pleasant Public High School in Wilmington, Delaware, and earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from Mount Holyoke College. I'm a co-founder of Westminster's Peace and Justice Work Group, which was formed in the spring of 2018 with the twin goals of combating violence in Wilmington and promoting racial justice. I've had a lifelong interest in history and was a political science history major in college, yet I didn't discover until 3 or 4 years ago the history of our country that you and I will be discussing. In my experience, American history classes stopped with the Civil War and a bit of Reconstruction with those darn carpetbaggers, and then it picked up again sometime after World War II. Much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes we hear or hold are a direct consequence of intentional economic and public policy. Understanding this history gives us a foundation for action to address the profound inequities that exist in our society today. So let's get started. Our purpose in these 6 videos is to develop a better knowledge and understanding of our country's racial history, a legacy of racial inequality grounded in the enslavement of millions of Black people, followed by decades of terrorism and racial subordination through public policy and cultural attitudes. Our 6 classes are as follows. Today, we look at the early years, then slavery by another name, public policy and the civil rights movement, mass incarceration and the war on drugs, voter suppression then and now, and finally, where do we go from here? So we begin with a view of the Atlantic Ocean from Point Comfort in the colony of Virginia, where in August of 1619, a ship appeared on the horizon. It had had a difficult crossing and was in desperate need of resupply. So the colonists were able to provide the ship's captain and crew with what they needed, and payment for that was made in the form of 20+ Africans who had been kidnapped from West Africa and brought on board for the voyage. So in 1619, in Jamestown, Virginia, the primary crop was tobacco, and cultivation of tobacco was challenging in a couple of regards. First of all, tobacco is very hard on the soil, and it is difficult to replant one tobacco crop after another in the same area. So the colonists were continually in need of more land, which they appropriated, stole from the Native Americans in the area. But they desperately needed workers as well. There were not that many English colonists in Jamestown at the time. So their first source of workers were poor whites who were recruited from Europe and brought to the colonies as indentured servants. And the deal was these poor white workers would be employed in tobacco cultivation for 7 years. And at the end of that time, they would receive their freedom and some land so that hopefully they could operate independently. These whites were covered by English common law. But when the Africans arrived, they were not. The means by which the Africans arrived in 1619 and for years afterward was through the Atlantic slave trade, which provided horrific conditions for these people who were brought from Africa to North, South, and Central America. Over the period of time of the Atlantic slave trade, more than 20 million Africans were kidnapped from their homes, but almost 50% of them died making the trek to the coast where they would meet the ships. And another 2 million died during the crossing. The slaves were branded with hot irons and restrained with shackles. Their living quarters was often a deck within the ship that had less than 5 feet of headroom. You see the diagram here of the bodies arrayed horizontally because sleeping shells cut this limited amount of headroom in half. With 300 to 400 people packed in a tiny area, an area with little ventilation, and in some cases, not even enough space to put buckets for human waste, disease was prevalent. So that the largest possible cargo might be carried, the captives were wedged below decks, chained to low-lying platforms stacked in tiers, as you see in this diagram, with an average individual space allotment that was 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, and maybe 3 feet high. Unable to stand erect or turn over, many slaves died in this position, and these were men, women, and children. If bad weather or equatorial calms prolonged the journey, the twice daily ration of water plus either boiled rice, millet, cornmeal, or stewed yams was greatly reduced, resulting in near starvation and attendant illnesses. This transit was called the Middle Passage because the ships began in Western Europe, took supplies to Africa, traded for the kidnapped Africans, brought them to the New World, where they were traded for more materials produced in North and South America, and then the ship would return to England or to other parts of Europe. So this middle passage from Africa to the New World took anywhere from 21 to 90 days. And this was the condition that the Africans suffered. So you can imagine that the death of 2 million people was not unexpected. Now, if we look at the institution of slavery, it was actually legalized beginning in 1641. And do you know the first state to legalize slavery? Well, it wasn't actually a state, it would have been a colony. The first colony to legalize slavery was Massachusetts. It was the first in 1641, and Georgia was the last colony to legalize slavery in 1750. And they did this by passing laws that declared that Africans were chattel. They were property. They were owned for life. Now in the North, most of these Africans were employed as house servants or unpaid skilled labor. But in the Southern colonies, their role in agriculture was profound. And they were relegated to a subhuman status, really even in the North. And a myth of racial inferiority developed, and it persisted as a justification for this system. The concept of humans owning humans certainly went against what would become the evolving view of the Constitution and the United States and the freedom of all. And so the way to justify this was to say that these Africans were really not quite human. They were not taught to read and write. In fact, it was illegal for them to learn to read or write. And if a slave were caught doing so, they could be subject to horrific punishment. They were not allowed to marry. And insofar as relationships formed and children were born, these families were often torn apart as one individual would be kept with an owner and other, quote, family members sold off or traded off to other plantations. Now, the view of slavery in the North began to shift. It wasn't as efficient or as necessary in the North, and it became not socially acceptable as the view of the freedom of the individual took root. So, excuse me, during the period from 1774 to 1804, all of the northern states abolished slavery. The last to do so was New Jersey in 1804. Now, when the US Constitution was ratified in 1787, there was an issue of how to treat these slaves. The southern states, colony states, wanted them counted because the number of representatives in the US House were determined based on population. The North did not want the slaves counted because it would give the southern states what they considered to be an unfair advantage in national representation. So a compromise was reached where it was written into the Constitution that a slave counted as 3/5 of a person. And interestingly, Native Americans counted not at all. In fact, the Declaration of Independence refers to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages. Now, when the Constitution was written, some of its framers believed that the institution of slavery would somehow fade away. But the South, wanting to hold on to the enslaved population, arranged yet another compromise where no earlier than 20 years after the adoption of the Constitution could the US outlaw the importing of slaves. So in 1808, Congress took that step and outlawed the importing of slaves via the Atlantic slave trade. And by that time, about 400,000 African slaves had been brought to the United States. But the need for slavery and slave labor, especially in the South, continued to grow as more and more land was cultivated and more workers were needed. And so if the US couldn't import slaves, then they needed a self-reproducing labor force. And so the slave auctions, the forced breeding of slaves to create yet more workers intensified. Families were split up as they were sold at auction. Slaves were marched in chains from one place to another, and they were held in pens before they were brought up for auction. It was a horrific scene. And if you have the opportunity to visit the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., there is a display area regarding the slave auctions that is powerful and excruciating to read, to watch, and to listen to. So families were destroyed, males were forced bred, all in the name of creating yet more slaves. Now, the economic imperative at the time, as I said, initially slaves worked in the tobacco fields. And as the land was exhausted, it pushed the westward expansion of the United States. And so the South began to turn to cotton as a crop, a highly labor-intensive crop. And the process of removing the sticks and twigs and casing from the cotton bolls was highly labor-intensive and sort of was an upper limit on how much cotton could be harvested and turned into fiber until Eli Whitney in 1793 invented the cotton gin. And this dramatically increased the amount of cotton that could be harvested and turned into fiber. And the demand for cotton exploded across the world as the South shifted to a textile economy. And by the mid 1800s, cotton was America's leading export. Now, there was a lot of continuing turmoil about slave states and free states between the North and the South. And an attempt to kind of put this at bay occurred with the passage of the Missouri Compromise in 1820, when the deal was that Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state and balanced by Maine as a free state. And further, that slavery would be banned from a latitude north of 3630. And that held for a little while. But in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act violated the terms of the Missouri Compromise. It added 2 states north of that latitude as slave states. Well, actually, it said that Kansas and Nebraska could make up their own mind. There were such internal divisions over the question of slave or free that Kansas actually had 2 legislatures. And then Kansas finally became a state in 1861 after the Civil War had begun. And Nebraska didn't become a state until after the Civil War had ended in 1867. Now, as all this was going on, the Republican Party was forming in the North in opposition to slavery. And at about that time, an infamous decision was made by the Supreme Court. And we're going to see through the course of these classes how many times Supreme Court decisions had a profound effect on the racial history of our country. The Dred Scott case, it was actually Sanford v. Dred Scott. And Dred Scott had been a slave in a slave state, had moved with his master to a free state, had married with his master's permission. They had moved back and forth, and when his master died, Dred Scott sued to be known as free. And after any number of initial court cases, this one finally made its way to the Supreme Court in 1857. And the 1857 Dred Scott decision declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, that it violated the Fifth Amendment because it deprived individuals of their property, slaves, without due process. The Dred Scott decision declared that Blacks, either slave or free, could never become citizens of the United States, and they had no federal rights. This Dred Scott decision is widely considered to be the worst decision ever rendered by the Supreme Court. Although one might argue that there have been some since that might be good candidates to challenge that assessment. In any case, excuse me, Chief Justice Taney wrote in the majority decision for Dred Scott, "In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the time and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights that the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. There you are. So by 1860, there were nearly 4 million slaves in the US, more than half in the South, where they made up a third of the population, and about 1 in 4 families in the South owned slaves. And 80% of the GDP of the entire United States was tied to slavery, either the direct agriculture in the South or related economic and commercial activities in the North. And so we come to the time of the Civil War. At this point, the white Southern identity was grounded in the belief, supported by the Supreme Court, that whites are inherently superior to Blacks, and that the condition of slavery is the African's right place in society. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. There were 4 candidates in that election, and Lincoln won. Within 3 months, 7 Southern states had seceded from the Union, followed by 4 more, and then followed by Missouri and Kentucky. Now, there's a myth that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Well, it was indeed about states' rights, but it was about states' rights explicitly in the state's ability to maintain and sustain and propagate slavery. And in order to understand that, all you have to do is look at the Articles of Secession issued by the various Confederate states. Mississippi's Article of Secession says, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce on the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the Black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has long been aimed at this institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandate of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin." And each of the states that seceded passed similar articles to affirm their decision to leave the Union. And even more significantly, just days literally before the Civil War began, on March 21st of 1861, Alexander Stevens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, gave what has been called the cornerstone speech. He said, "The new Constitution of the Confederacy has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institutions, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization." This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. The general opinion of the men of that day, that is the revolutionary period, was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution of slavery would be evanescent and pass away. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. We will see for decades the effect that this view of the inherent inferiority of the Black race has had on our country. So on April 12th, 1861, the Civil War begins. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed 4 million slaves in 10 southern states, the 10 southern states still in rebellion. Now, in reality, because they had seceded, he had no authority to free the slaves, but as battles were won by Northern soldiers in the South, they let the slaves go free because the Emancipation Proclamation had declared it so. Interestingly, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the border states, the slave-holding border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, because Lincoln did not want, by virtue of freeing those slaves, to encourage those states to join the Confederacy. And so that's the reason the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the 10 Confederate states still in rebellion. Well, as you know, the war continued, and eventually Robert E. Lee surrendered to U.S. Grant at Appomattox in April of 1865. At that point, there were 620,000 Americans dead and 1.5 million casualties. Almost 180,000 African Americans had fought with the Union, and 40,000 of them had been killed. So the damage to the US at a point in time when it had about 30 million citizens was enormous. So begins Reconstruction, a pivotal period. It was a new dawn. It was a time of hope. First, in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed by Congress in January, and it was ratified in December. It abolished slavery with a loophole, and we'll talk in our second class a lot more about that loophole. It abolished slavery except in the case of conviction of a crime. But in any case, by December of 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery had been ratified, but not by everybody. Delaware got around to ratifying the 13th Amendment in 1901. Kentucky took a while longer. It made the decision to ratify the amendment abolishing slavery in 1976. And Mississippi, good old Mississippi, we're going to hear a lot about that state. Mississippi finally ratified the amendment abolishing slavery in 2013. Now that period, 1865, began some terrorism against Blacks. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, that year, and its initial purpose was defined as amusement. So in 1865 and 1866, President Andrew Johnson, no fan of the freedom of former slaves, pardoned 7,000 secessionists and rescinded the land grants that had been made to former slaves, thereby reducing their economic opportunity to sharecropping. In 1868, Congress passed and the states ratified the 14th Amendment, which gave, excuse me, the rights of citizenship and due process to the former slaves, now freed. In addition, it banned former Confederates from holding public office in the southern states. And in order for the states that had been in rebellion to rejoin the Union, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. And so 10 of the 11 southern states had rejected it, but ultimately passed it in order to rejoin the Union. And in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. The little ladies were going to have to wait a little bit longer. But as of 1870, Black men had the right to vote. And the 1872 elections were extraordinary. And they showed what might have been possible if only Reconstruction could have continued. 90% of eligible Black males voted in the 1872 elections. More than 600 state office holders that were elected were former slaves. 16 members of the House of Representatives, US House of Representatives, and 2 senators were Black citizens elected in the 1872 elections. And the governor of Louisiana was a Black man. The last time that would happen until 1960. Excuse me. That same year, Congress passed and President Grant signed the Amnesty Act, which gave amnesty to 150,000 former Confederate troops, ended the disqualification for office holding of former Confederate leaders. Now, these were men who thought they would be imprisoned, if not executed, for treason. And here we are in 1872, they have been granted complete amnesty and can once again be elected to office. And so we see the first really significant terrorist actions against Black voters in the 1876 election. The backlash to the number of Blacks elected in 1872, the fact that white Confederates can now hold office again, and the 1876 presidential election ends in a tie. So there is a compromise worked out between Congress and the Supreme Court, the compromise of 1877, where the tie had been between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And the decision was made that Rutherford B. Hayes would become president if he promised to end Reconstruction. So he did, and they did. And in 1877, federal Reconstruction oversight was removed. And the end of one of the most promising periods in American equality came to an abrupt end. So I don't know if you're watching this with a group. There's some discussion questions for you, or if you've watched it by yourself, you might reflect on them. What did you learn that surprises you? How did our country's founding documents contribute to the treatment of Native Americans and African slaves? How did today's presentation help you consider whether the Civil War was fought over states' rights or slavery? And what implications does that have for today's use of the Confederate battle flag and for the monuments that exist in many Southern cities and towns? Finally, the 13th Amendment isn't as simple as it seemed. Why is that? So I leave you now and look forward to seeing you again with part 2 of Racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Thank you.